Being joined by Ellis Krauss, Professor Emeritus at UC San Diego, who specializes in Japanese politics, in Japanese society. And Professor Krauss, thanks so much for being with us. You know, political assassinations don't happen in Japan, just frankly. How do you think the country is holding up right now? Are they still kind of in a state of shock?
I think they're very much in a state of shock. I've talked to former graduate students of mine who are working for the Japanese government, and one of them said he could not even work today. He was in such a state of shock. I think everybody is, but especially in Japan. All the newscasts with interviews on the street show people who are clearly in a state of shock. Even the newscasters look a little bit like they're in a state of shock. It is unprecedented to have a former prime minister assassinated in post-war Japan. It happened frequently in pre-war Japan, political assassinations. It is not totally unprecedented to have a attempted political assassination. There have been 6 in post-war Japan, and they are rare. Only 2 have succeeded, and most of those were attempted by knives and swords, not guns. There have been a couple by guns, and usually by right-wing groups, actually, or people associated with the Yakuza, the organized crime in Japan, which is also associated with right-wing groups. We're not sure about this person's motivations at all. It's been very clear. We just don't have enough information yet.
Yeah, and we have been also following the elections that were going to be taking place on Sunday, the parliamentary elections. Was Shinzo Abe mounting somewhat of a political comeback, or was he kind of campaigning on behalf of someone else? We know he resigned for health reasons back in 2020, Japan's longest-serving prime minister at the time. So what exactly was he doing there in Nara yesterday?
Well, there is the House of Councilors election, as you said. The Liberal Democratic Party is fighting to get a majority of seats, to keep a majority in the upper house with their coalition partner. All the polls show that that is very likely. Even before this, I expect a big sympathy vote, or at least some sympathy vote, that will add to their margins of victory. But Abe was still a kingmaker in the Liberal Democratic Party, the party that has ruled Japan for all but 4 of the last 50 some odd years, since 1955, 60 some odd years. And he was helping other LDP candidates. In fact, that's why he was at Nara in front of the train station, which often is where campaign speeches are held, because it's a train culture in Japan, not so much an automobile culture, and people travel a lot by train. And so train stations are a good place to stand in front of and address crowds as they come out. Whether he was mounting a political comeback is unclear. He is a kingmaker from behind the scenes. He clearly has some favorite candidates. He did, I won't say intervene, but he used his weight to try and throw the election away from one candidate in the last prime ministerial LDP presidential election, and succeeded. As a result, Mr. Kishida became prime minister. Their relations have not always been that close, although Kishida apparently considers him something of a mentor. Yeah. But they do have some disagreements. So whether he's mounting a political comeback or not, he was still very powerful in Japanese politics, and his loss will have an impact.
Yeah, we of course saw the statement from Fumio Kishida earlier this morning, tears in his eyes. He was really rendered speechless from the shock of the assassination. Yes. You know, I want to talk about politics after Abe resigned back in August of 2020. We saw a very short-lived premiership from Yoshihide Suga, and then, of course, leading to Fumio Kishida, who is the current prime minister. Has there been, in your estimation, really since Abe's resignation, political dysfunction, or is it somewhat stable?
Oh, it's Japanese politics. As long as the Liberal Democratic Party is in power is always fairly stable. It's rotating chairs of factional coalitions, and it has always been that way. The factions are less powerful than they used to be, except in the selection of the prime minister and personnel matters. There they have retained a lot of power since the 1994 electoral reform, which was supposed to clean up Japanese politics, clean up corruption, make Japanese politics more policy-oriented. And all of that has come about. The one thing it did not do was completely eliminate the factions in the Liberal Democratic Party. Abe was the leader of the largest faction and therefore still had a lot of influence.
Ellis, we're learning that the shooter, the suspect, his name Tetsuya Yamagami, I think he's 41 or 42. He was a member of the Japanese Navy until 2005, and we're still trying to get a sense of what motivated him to do this. Clearly, this was out of political motivation, but some experts that we have been speaking to kind of took issue, or at least this shooter may have taken issue, was opposed to Japan's kind of increasing, I guess, approach to militarization. Remember, we always hear that Japan is a pacifist country, but in the wake of the war in Ukraine, Japan had talked about kind of raising its GDP expenditures on the military. Do you think that is going to be somewhat of a through line here as we try to get a cause of why this shooter did this?
You know, frankly, no one knows.
Okay.
I mean, when Abe was shot, my first reaction was exactly like that. I thought, oh, I wonder if it's a left-winger because of Abe's reputation as a nationalist, his moving Japan much more toward, building up its military. I want to get one thing straight. Japan has never been a pacifist country. I think the media does a disservice to Japan to call it that, because there is a subculture in Japan, a substantial one, but probably a minority, that has been anti-militaristic. And it's what puts the brakes on any more efforts to remilitarize Japan or to revise the Article 9, the famous Article 9 that abolished war and supposedly abolished the self-defense forces, which it obviously did not. But it's never been really pacifist. Only the Constitution really is pacifist.
Okay.
But this has been an incredibly divisive issue in post-war Japan. It is the prime divisive issue in post-war Japan. It's not abortion. It's not human rights. It's not all the things that get Americans up in arms. It is defense and the relationship with the United States. And there's been a huge polarization in Japan since the 1960s, since actually the war. That polarization has diminished a lot, but in recent years, thanks partially to Prime Minister Abe, I think, it has diminished to the point where I think almost for the first time, you could say there's almost a consensus in Japan, defense and foreign policy and security, and the relationship with the US. And that, frankly, is a consensus that Japan will stick to its self-defense as a justification for any actions, and primarily the defense of Japan, with some extensions of that to help the US. But it will not fully remilitarize, and it will not change much more of the Constitution, except probably to legitimize the self-defense forces or the military, which are clearly illegal under the words of the Constitution.
Okay, yeah, we are learning that Abe's remains will be flown back to Tokyo a little bit later. Today we'll have live coverage of that. It's also going to be interesting. Let's talk about the U.S.-Japanese relationship. It is so strong. It's a very, abiding, agreeable friendship, and it has been for so long. How was Abe instrumental to that? Meetings with President Obama, with President Trump, with then President George W. Bush. It was really inextricable.
Yes, it was. Let me just say one more thing about the perpetrator of this shooting in Japan.
Sure.
It is very unclear what his motivations are. Apparently, the police don't know yet what his motivations are. He was dissatisfied with Abe's relationship with some group, but the police have not said what that group is or what that dissatisfaction was. So we just don't know yet, but we will find out, I assure you, in the next few days. On the U.S.-Japan relationship, Abe has been crucial. Previous prime ministers supported the relationship, but did not strengthen it in terms of security and military very much. They broke small taboos one at a time so as not to infuriate and further the divisions in the country on these issues. So it was one taboo at a time. They moved the envelope a little bit at a time. Abe moved it more than any other prime minister in post-war Japan. I think especially in his law that allowed Japan to, under limited circumstances, albeit, to come to the defense of the United States in case Japan's livelihood and lifelines were threatened. Nobody has ever extended the U.S.-Japan security relationship that far. There's never been collective defense. You know, we are still committed to defending Japan according to the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty. Japan has never been committed to defending the United States. People don't realize that. But Abe moved that interpretation just a little bit closer to fact.
I want to talk as well about his rise in politics. Take us back, Ellis. Chart us the path that he got to the position as prime minister. He comes from a long and storied family. I believe his brother is currently the defense minister of Japan. So walk us through that, because this was a really meteoric rise.
Yes, but it was not unexpected. I mean, his grandfather was Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Kishi, who in fact oversaw the most polarization over security and the U.S.-Japan relationship in 1960 with the revision of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty, and was actually because of the huge demonstrations, and actually one student was killed in these demonstrations, he was kicked out of office by the party. He was just way too polarizing. Many people feel that Abe is trying to make up for his grandfather's shame of being kicked out because of that. And one of his motivations in extending Japan's security and relationship with the United States is to make up for that in part. But the grandfather prime minister, his father was foreign minister. He's been groomed from a very early age to be a politician. He was very young for Japanese politicians when he took over. He was 52, I believe, as prime minister. Most Japanese prime ministers are in the 60s and 70s in many cases. So he did have a meteoric rise. He was Prime Minister Koizumi. He was his very close right-hand man. And he did take over after Koizumi left office, but only for a year because he had problems and he claimed he was ill. And so he resigned after a year. But he came back in a remarkable comeback in 2012 and won an astounding big victory and managed to win something like 4 or 5 elections for both houses during the almost 8 years he was in power, the longest of any post-war prime minister or any prime minister in Japan's history.
Wow.
So he was a remarkable and skillful politician. The public was not always enamored of his policies. The one they loved was Abenomics, the attempt to revive Japan's economy after 20 years of being in the doldrums and recessions. Every time an election was held, he would get off the defense and security issues, which were not that popular, or nuclear power plants, which were not that popular after the 3/11 incident and tsunami in Japan. But he would switch the focus of the campaign to Abenomics, and it worked. Somebody has called this a bait and switch operation, but it was a very successful one, whereby he came back to power and stayed in power using that issue, which had mixed results, frankly, but it was his primary issue with the voters.
Yeah, let's talk, though, about his legacy. We've been talking a lot about kind of the security directives. He was strengthening those, the partnerships he was making with the United States, and so much of that. But there were crises that kind of demarcated points along his reign as prime minister, and you brought up one, I'm thinking of the earthquake back in 2011 that led to the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima. He really shepherded the country through that. And of course, he was still prime minister at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So these, crises dotted his rule as well.
Yes, I had just one correction. He was not prime minister at the time of the 3/11 earthquake. The opposition parties were actually in power for one of the first times in post-war Japan. And as a result of that and their mishandling of it, they were not, and many other mistakes they made in economics, for example, they were not popular with the public, which allowed him to come sweeping back to power in 2012. But he did face problems. He was not that close to Obama, apparently, in the early days of the administration, although they got much closer later on. He cultivated Donald Trump. While other world leaders were shying away or did not like Trump, Abe, whatever his real feelings, played golf with him a lot and made sure that Trump was friendly to Japan and that he did not harm Japan's interests too much. That was Abe's job, not to defend the interests of Japan. He's not an American. It wasn't his job to oppose Trump. It wasn't his job to support Trump. It was his job to defend the interests of Japan. And that's what he did by cultivating Trump. They apparently were fairly good golfing buddies.
Let's talk about, unfortunately, the nature of the shooting itself, Ellis. This apparently was a handmade gun that this suspect, yes, brought to this campaign rally. We've been speaking to experts as well that gun crime, gun violence is almost unheard of as well in the country of Japan. It doesn't happen hardly at all. It's very, very infrequent. We also know that the lengths that doctors went to save him yesterday into the late evening hours yesterday. They tried to give him massive blood transfusions. He had 2 bullet wounds in the neck and the heart. Essentially, doctors said there was a hole in his heart, and they just could not save him. Do you think the Japanese are, I've heard a lot of comparisons here that this is akin to their Kennedy assassination, although obviously Kennedy was in power at the time, Abe not. Do you think that's an apt comparison?
I do. I mean, I thought of that today as well. In terms of the shock value, it definitely was like the Kennedy assassination. A much more naive time before we had attempted assassinations, like Ronald Reagan, for example, which was also quite shocking to the American public. But we've become inured to violence, if not political violence. And we have had our own share of assassinations in our history. That was true of Japan before the war, but not post-war Japan. And so I think this in some ways is very comparable to the Kennedy assassination. The question of guns and gun control in Japan, the reason this gentleman, whoever he was, and we'll find out more, the perpetrator had to use a homemade gun is it is extraordinarily difficult to get a license in Japan to carry a weapon. And even after you have this license, going through, I think, 6 steps to get a license, the police visit your home annually, every single year to make sure you're keeping it safe and the ammunition safe from the weapon. And so it is extraordinarily difficult. I saw the statistics today, something like 1/3 of a Japanese per 100 people has a gun.
Wow.
Compare that to 120 people per 100 people among Americans.
That's right.
So it is extraordinarily difficult to get a gun in Japan. That's why he had to make a homemade gun. Now, the questions that are going to come up are, how did he get the ammunition? How did he get the explosives for the handmade gun? It was clear, as you've probably seen the video many times, that gun, had a discharge that was extraordinarily loud and also emitted smoke. So clearly there was some sort of explosive in there. How did he get it? How did he learn to make it? Where did he find out how to make it? questions that will need to be answered, and I can assure you the Japanese prosecutors and police will be attempting to answer that as we speak.
Yeah. A question, though, about the security posture of former prime ministers. Is there one? We know that this campaign-style rally was somewhat hastily arranged. Many there in Nara who are responsible for security preparations heard about this very last minute. And so maybe you can offer that. Obviously, former presidents here in the United States have Secret Service protection for life, but I don't think it's the same in Japan.
I'm not certain about that,
Okay.
But I do know there were security personnel on site. One of the questions the authorities in Japan, again, are, I'm sure, asking right now is, what happened? What happened to the security? How is this man able, with a concealed weapon, it was in a bag with tape around it, able to approach within 9 feet of a former prime minister from the back and shoot him in the back? And he shot not once, but it was clear from the video, twice.
Right.
He shot once, and I think he missed. It was clear that Abe was turning around at the very time that the second shot went off, and that's why he was hit in the throat, and I believe the left side as well, because he was turning around in that direction. So how did that happen? I think you saw the perpetrator being tackled in many videos.
Right away, yeah.
Yeah, and took it into custody right away. So people were there trying to protect Abe. How many there were, how skillful they were, how good was the cordon around him, I do not know. But there are clear videos showing the perpetrator, right directly behind Abe and approaching directly behind Abe, and nobody moved.
Ellis, just lastly, because we're getting in from President Biden, he's ordered flags on federal buildings to be flown at half-staff in honor of Shinzo Abe. We heard from President Biden today. He said even in the moment he was attacked and killed, he was engaged in the work of democracy to which he dedicated his life. President Biden visiting the Japanese embassy today in Washington, D.C., signing the condolence book. We're going to show our viewers that after we're done speaking with you. But, of course, I would imagine that there is going to be a U.S. delegation sent to the funeral. That hasn't been announced yet. We don't know who possibly might go. Do you think President Biden will go? Do you think he should go?
I can't answer that question. I think at the very least, Vice President Harris should go. Somebody very high up. Rahm Emanuel, the U.S. ambassador to Japan, immediately issued a very nice and grieving statement on behalf of the U.S. today. Every single statement I've seen by world leaders, whether they had disagreements with Abe or not on policy, has been profound and profoundly sincere.
Yeah.
I think, 8 years in office for a Japanese prime minister, he got to know very intimately most world leaders. He put Japan back on the world stage as the major power it should be, after years of it not being quite so important as a leading power. But so I think all the tributes are sincere. Yeah. I think they're very personal. The Indian Prime Minister Modi said he called Abe his friend that he has lost. He's been, everybody is very touched. And I think the fact that it occurred in the middle of an election campaign was particularly shocking to the Japanese. Yeah. The very, symbol and process of democracy.
Ellis, just lastly, though, just personally for you, who have studied Japanese society for your entire career, and when you got the news, what went through your mind? This is going to be, shocking. The reverberations of this will be felt for a very long time. But just personally, what are you kind of thinking at this moment? Is this a watershed moment for Japan?
My wife screamed, "Oh my God," when she saw the news on her laptop. And she said, "Turn on NHK News," which is the Japanese public broadcaster like the BBC in England. It's not like PBS. It has a huge audience.
And it did some great reporting last night. I just a shout out to NHK. I was very, very fast with updates.
They do. I have a book out on NHK and its relationship to politics, and they have some fabulous reporters. So, I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. It was literally unbelievable. In my country, Japan, that I've been visiting or living in for 54 years, where I have many friends, some of them fairly high up. One of my friends in Japan is an executive assistant to former Prime Minister Koizumi. I sent him condolences today. But you're just in shock and you're just obsessed with the news. I mean, we were on the news all last night. This morning, the first thing we turned on the news during the night. I've been on it frequently. That in this very safe country, a freedom, by the way, that Americans do not understand, the freedom for personal safety, which you feel constantly in Japan. It was just unbelievable. I think, again, shock is the best word I can think of.
Yeah. Ellis Krauss, Professor Emeritus there at UC San Diego, and an expert in Japanese politics. Thank you for this, really wide-ranging discussion. We appreciate your time. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too. Great questions, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.